Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are going to deal with an aspect of the story featuring the patriarch Jacob. This narrative is among the most compelling narratives in Genesis, or for that matter in the Bible. Even those who are not all that familiar with biblical material know that Jacob famously exploited his older brother Esau twice. The first time was when Esau had been out in the field, presumably working, and got home famished. Jacob had been cooking lunch. Esau rather inelegantly demanded a bite because of his hunger. Astonishingly, Jacob invited Esau to eat, but asked him first to make an oath regarding the family birthright. Among other things, a birthright was supposed to guarantee one's future. Thinking he was about to starve to death, Esau took the oath and in the process sold his birthright to Jacob. The narrator leaves no doubt about the foolishness of what Esau had done. He, quote-unquote, despised his birthright. That story is in Genesis 25, verses 29 to 34. At this point, there is no narrative assessment of Jacob's behavior, but it is hardly necessary. While it was colossally stupid for Esau to sell his birthright for a bowl of soup, Jacob hardly shines in this episode. Esau was his older twin brother. All he wanted was a little food. Granted, Esau came close to demanding lunch, but was Jacob justified in exploiting either his brother's hunger or his lack of manners? The second time Jacob exploited Esau, he had help in the person of Rebekah, his mother. She had overheard her elderly husband Isaac make plans to pass on the family blessing to Esau. After all, Esau was the older child of Isaac and Rebekah. In that culture, the privilege belongs to the oldest male child. In this case, this was unquestionably Esau. While Esau went out to hunt game, which he was subsequently to prepare as a ritual meal for the blessing, Rebekah sprung into action. She summoned Jacob and told him to grab a couple of goats so that she could prepare a dish that would taste just like Esau's. She then told Jacob that once the dish was ready, he could take it to his father and get himself the blessing that Isaac thought he would be conferring on Esau. Jacob did not object that this scheme was wrong, but he was extremely worried about getting caught and, instead of receiving a blessing, would be cursed for his efforts. But his mother had the plan worked out down to the last detail. In his dotage, Isaac could no longer see well. That meant that he would be unable to know which son he was blessing. But Isaac's sight was not the only problem that had to be solved. Esau was hirsute, that is, a very hairy man. By contrast, Jacob was smooth. What would happen if Isaac embraced his son, only to discover the smooth one was there rather than the hairy one? Rebekah had anticipated this, so she used the skin of the goats so that Jacob could wear this ridiculous disguise to fool his decrepit father. That would take care of Isaac's tactile sense. The dish would take care of the sense of taste. Isaac's bad eyesight was a boon for Rebekah's plot. The only thing that Rebekah and Jacob had to worry about was Isaac's sense of hearing. Would Isaac recognize Jacob's voice as distinct from Esau's? Sure enough, when Jacob went to his father the ruse worked except for his voice. The dish prepared tasted just like Esau's. When Isaac embraced Jacob, the goatskins made him think he was hugging Esau. Because of his failed sight, he did not realize that Jacob was in his presence. However, he was suspicious of Jacob's voice and said as much. But in the end, his acute sense of hearing did not trump his other senses. Therefore, Isaac ended up blessing Jacob in the place of his elder son Esau. All of that is from Genesis chapter 27. Of course, we remember that while Rebekah was pregnant, God had told her that she had, quote-unquote, 2 nations in her womb. Not only that, the elder child would be dominated by the younger child, reversing what was common in that culture. At that point, though, we had no idea which child would emerge first, since they were engaged in a prenatal struggle. Esau barely was born first. His younger brother had grabbed onto his heel. Sadly for Esau, winning this contest to be born first ended up being a losing proposition. The elder would eventually give way to the younger. That result would accord with God's word. That visitation from God is found in Genesis 25, verses 22 through 26. However, Rebekah had never told anyone what God had told her. Jacob would indeed become the child of promise, but the way he got into that position ultimately would require nefarious methods. On his own, Jacob convinced Esau to sell his birthright. On her own, Rebekah had no qualms about involving Jacob in her ruse to make sure that Isaac blessed his younger rather than his older son. And Jacob had no trouble in buying into this scheme. So, Jacob ended up the child of promise, howbeit by dubious means. Due to Esau's understandable outrage about what had transpired, Jacob was forced to leave the family and stay for a time with his mother's family. That time ended up being 20 years. During his absence from his home, Jacob became fabulously wealthy. The question to be posed is, did Jacob get off scot-free after being complicit in such unethical behavior? The answer to that question is yes and no. Let me explain. Since Jacob's selection as the child of promise was a function of sheer elective grace according to God's inscrutable will, then, as a matter of fact, Jacob's behavior simply does not factor into the equation. Jacob was not chosen because of his character or his ethical posture. Again, this was the grace of God, nothing more, nothing less. The Apostle Paul made the point that God's election was on the books, so to speak, before the boys were born and had done anything to induce divine selection. God's election had nothing to do with the morality of those being elected. From this perspective, Jacob was not punished for his bad behavior when he exploited and deceived both his brother and his father. Nevertheless, he did not escape punishment entirely. When he was with his mother's family, he got a healthy dose of poetic justice. Poetic justice involves a touch of irony, in that the punishment is mirrored by the nature of the deed being punished. So, how did poetic justice manifest itself in the Jacob story? First, he met his cousin Rachel and was immediately smitten. When he went to work for her father, Uncle Laban, Jacob had not worked very long when his uncle offered Jacob to, quote, name his wage. Family or not, Jacob deserved to be paid. Any employee dreams of a day when the boss says, "Name your wage." When Jacob says what he expects to be paid, however, he lowballs himself. He is head over heels in love with Rachel, so it is no surprise that he will include her in this bargain. But instead of offering to work for 6 months or even a year in exchange for her hand in marriage, he suggests working for 7 years, after which she will be his bride. The offer was absurd. Why so long? Half that time would have been too long. Unfortunately for Jacob, his thinking was clouded by his appetite for Rachel. His sexual appetite, to be specific. Appetite had once led Esau to sell his birthright, since he thought he would die of starvation that very day. No one dies of starvation after going 1 day without food. Appetite was the cause of Esau's ridiculous negotiation. Appetite was the cause of Jacob's ridiculous negotiation. Both men were betrayed by their appetites. The only difference was the anatomical location of the appetite. That is poetic justice. Of course, Jacob's poor negotiating skills were not over when he made the initial offer. Keep in mind that Rachel, like Jacob, were both younger siblings. Rachel had an older sister, Leah. While the narrative pointed out that Rachel was drop-dead gorgeous and shapely as well, Leah was described either as having weak eyes or delicate eyes. In short, depending on translation, either she was unattractive or her eyes were her only compelling feature. When Jacob had worked the 7 years, Uncle Laban arranged for the wedding. On the honeymoon night, Jacob consummated his love. But in the morning, to his astonishment and consternation, Leah was the woman in the marriage bed. Jacob was a young man in his prime with all his faculties and senses intact, and somehow he did not notice that he was making love with Rachel's sister. His father was once deceived in a tent, but poor Isaac had an excuse. He was old, frail, and could not see. Jacob was the very opposite, yet he, too, was deceived terribly. That is poetic justice. Additionally, Jacob and his mother quite recently had conspired against the hapless Esau. Jacob had conspired in the lunch scene. Then he joined his mother when they exploited Isaac's frailty to rob Esau of his blessing. It turns out that Uncle Laban was also capable of deception. He played Jacob like a fiddle. That is poetic justice. This pattern continues. Because of what had happened, Jacob was obliged to work another 7 years to earn the rights to Rachel. He had already married Leah. Not only that, each of the sisters had a personal handmaiden. These women became Jacob's secondary wives. Though he had only been madly in love with one woman, Jacob ended up having 4 wives. As the story proceeds, the women bargain for sleeping rights over the years. The women call all the shots. In this patriarchal society, Jacob is being ordered around like a houseboy, by his wives, most especially Leah and Rachel. In part, Leah and Rachel are rivals for Jacob's affection. This is sibling rivalry at its best. How would one characterize Jacob's relationship with his brothers as anything but the epitome of sibling rivalry? That is poetic justice. There is one final example of poetic justice. After 20 years, according to the story, Jacob has finally become wealthy. He is also tired of being exploited by his father-in-law, Uncle Laban. So he talks to Leah and Rachel, and they agree to go back to Canaan with their husband. The Jacob family has a 3-day head start before Laban realizes that his daughters, his son-in-law, and all that wealth has absconded. He set out to stop this nonsense, apparently having violence on his mind, but the Lord intervened by telling Laban not to lay a finger on Jacob. However, when Jacob's family left, unbeknownst to him, Rachel had stolen her father's household gods. Why she did this is not mentioned. Plus, their significance elicits no narrative comment. But very soon we will learn how important Rachel's action was. When Uncle Laban catches up with the absconding family, he fusses and fumes, but does not put any of his emotions into action. At the same time, he is furious that someone has taken his household gods. He demands that they be returned. Of course, Jacob knew nothing about this, so he gives Uncle Laban permission to search to his heart's content to find out who in his party, including servants, may have taken the gods. Jacob even goes so far as to allow the culprit, when found, to be executed on the spot. Uncle Laban begins searching everyone. After a while, the only one that has not been searched is Rachel. She is sitting in her tent, using her saddlebags as a chair. The narrator lets us know that that is precisely where she had hidden the household gods. Laban begins his search by groping around Rachel's tent. That is the very same verb used to describe Isaac groping when Jacob was in his presence pretending to be Esau. For the second time in his life, Jacob is being threatened by someone who is groping. Keep in mind that Rachel has not yet given birth to Benjamin, who will be crucial in the story featuring Joseph. Just in time, Rachel says something that deters her father from searching the saddlebags. She tells Laban that she is having her period, and that it would therefore be uncomfortable for her to stand. Her dad is somewhat embarrassed by this very personal comment and says that he has searched enough. Laban finally leaves. Rachel is saved, and Jacob's family prepares to continue their journey. But when Uncle Laban was groping in Rachel's tent, that was one more example of poetic justice. In the end, of course, Jacob will remain the child of promise. This was the result of God's grace. God's election was unrelated to Jacob's moral composition. Still, when all these examples of poetic justice were manifested, the narration lets us know that even the elect cannot escape entirely punishment for their deeds, even if the punishment comes in the form of poetic justice. Go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. Also, if you have a question for me for a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.